about our kids, deeply about education for Minnesota, and deeply about trying to find a way in which all children in our schools can learn successfully and effectively. We can really at least move toward what our culture puts upon schools, which is public schools are supposed to solve our social problems. So I think it's 4 years ago now that we started the Courageous Conversations project with the St. Paul Public Schools. It was also 4 years ago now, I believe, that the St. Paul Public Schools invited a lot of the public into several different action teams, which provided a lot of information back to St. Paul Public Schools, which led to the formation of the state's first public school system to have a racial equity policy. And then began the Courageous Conversations project, which you will hear more about today. So we're privileged to have the Chief of Staff of St. Paul Public Schools, Michelle Walker, and the head of the Office of Equity, Michelle Bierman, here with us this morning. And this will be videotaped, so people who are not here today, if they want to know what's going on, send them to our website, mnachievementgap.org, to hear what's going on from people who are at the center of this. So Michelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Grant, and good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So I'm very excited to be back here again talking about this, and as Grant said, he was gracious enough to co-chair our Achievement Gap committee when we adopted our strategic plan and opened up an invitation to the community to be a part of how we go about implementing that plan. And one of the pieces that were discussed, though not explicit at the time, was for the district to be really intentional about its efforts around then cultural proficiency and now more explicitly racial equity. And as Mr. Evans said, that did result in our board courageously adopting a racial equity policy. We actually weren't the first to adopt, but we are the only district right now, well, the first district to have a living policy, so to speak. And we have some others who have joined us in that effort, including Minneapolis, which I know you'll be hearing from them pretty shortly. So let me just explain a little bit about what myself and my colleague Michelle Bierman are going to be doing today. Because we have a racial equity policy, we have reported to our board on where we are with the policy. Now, prior to us having an actual policy adopted, which happened in July of, correct here, July of 2013, we did engage in racial equity transformation, professional development around that work, and reported to the board on where that progress was. But part of the policy that was adopted included language where the superintendent and administration would actually report to the board on our implementation on those efforts. And part of our broader strategic plan is to report on the elements of that. And as you see in our new phase 2 of Strong Schools, Strong Community, racial equity is the first of 5 focus areas. And so this presentation is built off of one that we shared with our board in January, where we talked about the implementation of our racial equity policy and what we call vision cards. And you have one of these on your table. This is actually our version of a balanced scorecard, and it reports on the metrics that we have developed around our racial equity plan. You should also have on your table a document that says Racial Equity Policy 101, and it is an outline of the elements of our policy and the programs associated with that. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does show some of the programs that we have in our system and how they align with aspects of our policy. So I will be sharing our presentation, delivering the presentation with Ms. Bierman, who will join me shortly. And what we will do is we've organized this around the elements of the policy. So there are 3 pieces of our policy. We share what the language in that policy is, and then what are the metrics that we have identified associated with that, and where are we? What are the recent efforts, and where are we going to be going next steps looking forward? So I ask that you bear with me. There are actually 36 slides, a title slide and an ending slide, so 34 slides of content. It's a lot of information, but we're a pretty small group, so I'll work with our group, and if you have questions, we'll take the questions as we go along. So, let me first explain why we do vision cards and what vision cards actually capture. So for the first stage of our strategic plan, we had 8 vision cards that looked at different elements of our organization. Leadership, student data and work, achievement, equity. We looked at also our resources, and they were all aligned to the goals of our strategic plan: achievement, alignment, and sustainability. Those goals remain the same in the second phase of our plan, but our cards are now organized around the 5 focus areas, racial equity being the first of those. And what the vision cards allow us to do is to look not only at the outcomes, which typically school systems report on: how are we on standardized tests, attendance, discipline, but it also asks us to examine the processes that we have in place, the systems that we have established to actually influence those outcomes. And so the majority of our card and the metrics associated with them actually measure process pieces, not just the outcomes, because those are the areas that we can most influence. We can actually influence the processes that we are putting in place to produce the outcomes that we want. And so this is the cycle that we look at for all of our cards, and with the exception of when we report out on standardized test results, we're really looking at what are the adult behaviors that we can measure and improve. I'm going to actually ask Ms. Behrman to come forward and talk about our overall racial equity transformation plan, what are the phases of development that we have in place, and then I'll come back and share some specifics around our metrics. So, Michelle.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
I don't think the mic's working.
Well, yeah, I don't think it is either. And I can stand here for a couple of minutes. I tend to wonder, that's why they put this mic on me. I wonder. Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon. As Chief Walker said, we have been engaged in a racial equity transformation plan for over the last 4 years. And there were particular phases to the work that we engaged in. And we think about this transformation in those 3 areas, as well as what we're doing is eliminating our district's institutional racism in order to increase achievement, including these pieces. And basically, we want our diverse students' experiences to be an indicator, a contributor of success, rather than point out to the disparities that we're seeing currently. And we are able to predict achievement based on race, even when taking out poverty in St. Paul Public Schools. And so that's an important piece to note as we isolated race in this district, rather than looking at a multicultural approach or approach that isolated poverty first. So in taking a look at this, we have what we refer to as our phase 1 of training. And this was designed intentionally. Leadership at the highest level began the training. So the superintendent, the school board, superintendent's cabinet, the principals all began a year-long process to develop their capacity, as well as what we call the lens of equity. The ability to see bias, the ability to see how that plays into how we operate within the systems. That included a 2-day foundational seminar, which introduced us to a protocol. When you're a large district, having a protocol or a shared language to engage, sustain, actually to engage, deepen, and sustain is really, really key, because otherwise what happens is interracial conversations tend to break out down after the engagement piece, and we really need to dig deep in the work. We also began equity teams at each of our building sites. So it was 4 to 6 members, sometimes up to 8 folks who engaged together over a year of deep training to both learn the framework, take a look at systems tools, and adaptive strategies and thinking in order to really look at what's happening in our building. Are we seeing a process that's predictable by race? If so, how do we collectively work with our staff to begin to break that down so that we don't have that happening within that school site? Phase 2 was moving into increasing training and development. You start seeing your next level of staff members. So Beyond Diversity extended to staff site and departmental folks. And again, this is developmental, so if you send a group of teachers or staff members to go through Beyond Diversity, the key is how are those folks supported once they come back into the building? Because implementing the work is much different than just going and receiving a training piece. And so we began to see this more and more building that capacity. And our instructional coaches. So the idea is, if you have a group of instructional coaches that are servicing buildings, how is their will, skill, knowledge, and capacity in place to be able to do that work? And so these were our early foundational pieces, and you can see the increase from here from the leadership into the school staff, and now we are full working with school staff in phase 3. Most of our work now has transformed from the reliance on an outside facilitator, Pacific Educational Group, to internal facilitation. And that was designed. When we began to work with PEG, the idea was that each year we would lower our dependency on PEG and build our internal capacity. And that's the model that Pacific Educational Group uses as well. So the majority of Beyond Diversities are facilitated internally. And it was interesting. External facilitators were really, really well sought out for our leadership. Internal for our teachers. So our teachers and building staff members, the satisfaction of Beyond Diversity went up when we began doing this internally. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. We have some very talented folks. We also are able to really link it to the lived experiences of folks in St. Paul Public Schools. Our school board, our superintendent, our cabinet continue this work, and now we're moving into how do we bring this to the classroom. We've piloted some pieces that have brought some instructional strategies, and we continue to do that. And then our Office of Teaching and Learning is grounding their work in both getting their coaches up to speed, as well as we'll talk later in the teaching and learning section. I spent a little bit more time on these 3 than we normally do because it is a lot of information. And we really want to outline that piece of beginning with the leadership and then moving to the school sites, the folks in the school sites. Because the work we're doing in St. Paul Public Schools is less about individual or random acts of equity or inequity. It is about the systems in place that we're able to say, over time, we know that we have more students of color suspended, particularly our American Indian and African American students. It's disproportionate for the student population. There's something within that system we have to look at. It's not just individuals. The individual prejudice is much easier to get at than that deep-rooted historical piece. Engagement, leadership, and also teaching and learning are the 3 parts of the policy, and I'm going to highlight engagement. You also have a sheet on your table. And what we did here is we didn't make a laundry list of everything that we do in the district, but we aligned items and areas that we've changed or developed once the policy was approved in July of 2013. So you'll see under engagement several different pieces, and I'll go through a few of those with the vision card. So when we think about engagement, we're talking student, family, and community engagement. And when we move into this, we are including students' multiple racial perspectives, engaging family and community members with staff and students district-wide for culturally appropriate and effective partnerships between home and school, and inviting and including community members. So this becomes a foundational piece that I can match up different programming and different plans that are happening in the district and say, are we meeting this? Is this really student voice? Or are these adults bringing students and asking them opinion? And there's some differences with that. So moving into this, we have some ways that we're measuring, and one of the ways is parent advisory committees. 5 out of 10 of the parent advisory committees currently present formal recommendations to the administration, and the goal is for that to be 100%. And so we have a variety of parent engagement groups, African American, Karen, Hmong, Somali. We now have a gender inclusion, gender, it's the whole span of LGBTQ. It's not just our trans and queer youth, but it's also our LGBTQ pieces and families. And then we also have a, I always get it wrong, Chief Walker, the environmental one, right? Yeah, the environment. And then we'll be looking at attendance, behavior, and courses, the students of Parent Academy graduates versus students of non-participants. So we have a Parent Academy where families come in and they learn about the school system. And as parents are learning about the school system, everything from advanced classes to navigating to interrupting, is that showing out in how the students are performing? And that will be the measurement we use next year. We're also moving to some deeper Parent Academy pieces, Parent Academy 201, so to speak, that dig in even deeper. You have to understand the system to change the system, and so the baseline was the initial academies. Then when we look at a few other recent efforts, which are on your sheet, this idea of small talks, big issues. So members of the engagement office, other folks go to coffee shops or meet with groups who request to meet with individuals in the district, and we'll just sit down and have a conversation. It could be an overview of the racial equity work. It could be a conversation about a new program that's in place. We have also targeted community dialogues. This would, I think, be an example of a community dialogue, and we get to questions at least. Sharing with the superintendent, social media, and parent advocacy and leadership. We've had quite an increase in social media over the last 2 years. A lot of interaction back and forth, and I'm sure you've heard of some of that. It's, well, tweeting is not always your friend, but social media, getting our information out in multiple ways. And parent advocacy and leadership. Our parents have stepped up to advocate, lead. In fact, we have a program that is starting. It's really less of a program and more of a new way of doing business around reading in terms of getting students connected to books that represent themselves. And we've actually been working with parent groups to have an event at the Multicultural Resource Center coming up in April where families are coming in to read with their children, pick out books that the children see themselves in. And that's something that we're doing as a year-long process. This is the public participation, I guess I would call it a rubric, the goals. It's the idea of when you're working or engaging, are you working to inform, consult, involve, collaborate, or empower? And each one of those areas comes with a variety of techniques. And this is an engagement process is the proper piece. And this engagement process is something that we actually worked with and did some training, my office did with one of our local organizations in being able to pull out, are we informing folks? Is this more of a collaboration? And what are the key differences? Have you ever been invited to something and it's supposed to be collaboration and all the decisions are made? Yeah. So this helps us kind of really start getting focused on what is collaboration versus consultative. And that process is actually being used quite a bit in engagement as they make decisions and structure work in the district as well as in other departments. We used it in the Multicultural Resource Center to look at how we're moving to more of a community center and including family and engagement more. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chief Walker.
Michelle, before we start, if you have questions, please write them down and then I will present them to the speakers.
I want my prop this morning of the podium. If this starts to make that awful echoing sound, then let me know. Okay, so can you please take this from me because I'm going to create quite a disturbance. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the leadership part of this policy and our work. And this, I'm going to warn you now, is where we have all of our metrics, a lot of data, so I will try to walk through it. But I first want to highlight that there are actually 4 elements of the leadership policy, and I believe the text is actually on the document that you have in front of you. I'm going to focus here on items 2 to 4, because I'm going to come back a little bit later and talk about item 1, which is around recruitment, employing, and supporting our diverse staff. So here I want to focus in the next few slides on our business practices and how we're holding ourselves accountable, and walk through the metrics that we've aligned with these elements of our policy. So the measures that I'm going to discuss may not initially seem like they would be measures that would fall under leadership. And in fact, when we first did our strategic plan metrics for the first vision cards, these were actually aligned with our achievement and equity card. So you'll notice that here we're going to be looking at our gifted and talented data, special education data, absences, suspensions, and how we as central administrators are actually supporting and implementing racial equity work, as well as providing professional development. And the first few metrics, which are academic outcome metrics, are actually aligned to our policy, to this section of our policy, because if you remember, this is talking about our business and operational practices. And when you talk about referrals to special ed, referrals into gifted and talented programming, even how we identify and monitor absences and suspensions, those are all the results of adult actions. Either the actions to suspend or not suspend a student, or the decisions and the design of a system that supports gifted and talented identification, or how we're identifying children for special ed. So we align these metrics that previously were under our achievement and equity card to the leadership part of our racial equity work, because these are the places where we as adults have probably the greatest influence in changing the outcomes. So the way that we actually measure those metrics, we use something that we call an equity ratio. And essentially we're looking at how many times more likely is a student group to experience an outcome when compared to the student group that experiences that outcome the least. So this equation here is really looking at how we actually come to that number. And I will show you an example of what that looks like. So in this example, we are saying here that our white students are twice as likely as our Asian students to be suspended at least one time. So you'll see the denominator is our Asian student group, which are the least suspended in this example, and the numerator is the white student group. And we come up with an equity ratio that says that the white student group is twice as likely. This is actually not our real data. I will get to that in a second. But I also want to call your attention to the scale on the bottom of this example. And this is a scale that we use consistently across every metric that we're measuring in the vision cards, whether we're talking about buses that are arriving on time, or whether we're talking about how many times a student group has been suspended. And the reason why we use this metric is it helps us as a district understand where we should focus our attention. So yes, we should focus our attention on anything that is critical, meaning that this is probably the worst in terms of the outcomes that are associated with that particular metric. But as an organization, we probably need to be paying attention to some resource-related items that are critical as much as we need to be paying attention to some student outcomes. And so it allows us to have a relatively sane measure of the importance and where we need to focus our attention. So, to actually talk about our data, I started with suspensions because this is what has received probably the most attention in the media around our results, and it is an area that there is huge commitment about the need for change, and an area where the predictability is really great. It is also, the metrics that we have associated here, the one that is most alarming. So what this particular measure is showing us here is that within our district, our Black student group is nearly 14 times as likely to be suspended as our Asian student group. And when we first presented this to the board, I want to say 3 years ago, we spent a lot of time having discussion in our board meeting about this. And actually, this is lower than it was when we first presented it, which was 16 times as likely when we first introduced this metric. So there is some movement in the positive direction, but you can see visually represented here that we are really talking about huge disparity. And again, to go back to the fact that these are adult actions, there are a lot of decisions along the way that lead to a child being suspended, from the referral from the instance in the classroom to the referral out of the classroom to the decision that's made in the administrative office to the student being out. And one thing that you should also know when I get to the absences is that if a child is suspended, they're not only suspended and losing instruction, but they're also counted as absent from school if they're suspended out of school. So the other piece that I wanted to highlight with this metric is it not only talks about the comparison of gaps between black and white, which very often the achievement conversation becomes, but it also helps you to see the relative difference within the students of color. So you'll see right behind our black student group are our American Indian students, who are almost 10 times as likely to be suspended as an Asian student in our system, and our Hispanic students that are almost 5 times as likely. And so it helps you to understand the impact of this particular measure, and it remains at the critical level. It has been at the critical level since we've been measuring it, although we are seeing some improvement. And again, this is measuring the disproportionality. So even in our system, as suspensions are going down, I want people to understand that suspensions have gone down since we've started measuring this. This is looking at the disparity. And so that disproportionality has not changed since we've been measuring this. So this slide talks about some of the efforts, recent efforts that we've had to address this and where we might be going in the future. So one of the things that we have been doing in our district is actually aligning our behavioral programming. So I believe that some of you may have heard about positive behavior intervention supports. PBIS is the acronym that many people use. We had a team of people who were devoted to helping us both understand PBIS and supporting schools in their implementation of that. At the same time, we had our equity office that was engaging the community in a solutions, not suspensions effort. We called it in the district, Solutions in Action. We also had a department that was looking at how we track data and support schools with that. And what we're actually doing now is aligning all of that behavioral programming in our district in one place, so people are actually talking to each other and being consistent in how we support schools. We're also looking at some consistent protocols to use. We've all been tracking data, but we haven't necessarily been doing it consistently. And so we want to have pieces in place to support more consistent approach to that. And we also have a rights and responsibility handbook in our district, which we've had for quite some time. And we continue to update that and review that and bring a racial equity lens to that work. And that will be ongoing in terms of our recent efforts. As we look forward, we also want to have a more nuanced and detailed, comprehensive conversation around our referral data. So it's not just the suspension, which is the outcome, the end result of the actions that I talked about, but how are we looking at our referral data to know what time of day are we seeing a peak in student behaviors that we don't want to see? Is it a particular subject that we're seeing this happening more than once? Is there a particular place in the school that we're seeing instances happening? And how can we change schedules and interventions to support being able to help students in that? We also really want to talk about how we develop shared leadership at the school sites. It's as much, if not more important, that we do that work at the site level than have centralized supports for it. So yes, as a central administration, we can create protocols that are consistent. We can create tools that can support schools. But how do we build the leadership at the school site? Because actually some of our best examples of where we've seen suspension turn around, it's because of the work that's happened at the school site, at the systems that have been put in place and the support that exists at that site. And then of course, ongoing professional development is always necessary. So you've seen the model of the equity ratio. The next few metrics that we're using uses the same ratio to identify this. This one is actually looking at how many times more likely is a student to be identified for gifted and talented. And you'll see here that our white student groups in grades 1 to 5 are 4 times as likely to be identified for gifted and talented than our black students. And unless there's something magic about the water in Minnesota that goes to the families where white students live, clearly there is something that we need to examine in this proportionality. in this disproportionality metric here. And it's been about a quarter, it's been about this 4 times ratio since we've been measuring it. But what we are seeing, again, this is an example of the disparities being slow to close, but we are seeing, with the changes that we've put in place, the identification of more students of color into our gifted and talented programs. So this is an area that we actually expect these metrics to change soon. And to talk a little bit more about that, we've actually refined our identification process. And so what you should know is that all kindergarten students in our district take our assessment for gifted and talented identification. And that used to be an assessment called NNAT. We are now using an assessment called COGAT, and it actually measures multiple talents of a student. So it has quantitative and verbal, and it has a nonverbal section as well. And this is a new assessment, and by use of this assessment, we're actually seeing more students of color be identified. In kindergarten, we do a sample of that assessment. We call it a screener. It's a shorter assessment, but we also assess every child that has not yet been identified for gifted and talented in the 2nd grade. And in the 2nd grade, they use that more comprehensive assessment. So we have changed the tool that we're using. We have also enhanced the portfolio portion, so students who actually don't meet the cut score, so to speak, on our gifted and talented assessment also have an opportunity to put forward a portfolio to be identified. And with part of the reason for shifting to that test is that it also gives us a sense of the multiple talents that students have, and that we're able to meet and address those particular needs. So it's not just a one, you passed it or you didn't. We now have an assessment of the verbal skills, quantitative skills, etc. of our student group. As we look forward, we're going to also be aligning our accelerated services district-wide. So you may know that some of our schools have had specialists who provide gifted and talented support to students, and other schools may not have those specialists. So how do we align those services across our district so that we really are providing the supports that students need to accelerate their learning in whatever environment they may be? And particularly at secondary school, we continue to look for ways to increase the access to accelerated coursework, whether it be AP, IB, or even our post-secondary options at colleges and universities. And most important is really engaging our community in how we develop our practices, as well as even in the portfolio process, for us to be looking at ways to make sure that that is as culturally appropriate as possible. The next set of metrics that I'm going to look at are special education referrals. Again, this is using the same equity ratio, and here we see that our American Indian students are more than 3 times as likely to be referred to special ed as our Asian student group. And you'll see the differences here. Actually, we have made considerable progress in this area. We've been in the progress and vision level for off and on over the times that we've been measuring it, but again, you see the disparity here, almost 3 to 1 for this metric as well. As we look at special education and some of the supports that we're putting in place, our schools have student assistance teams, which have a number of people from different representation in the school community to support our students. And you may have also heard about our efforts around co-teaching. And here, this is where a general education teacher and a special education teacher are co-teaching a class that has students that are identified for special education services, as well as general education students in the same environments. Students are included, and we've seen some positive results for doing that work, where our special education students are not losing content, core content, and our teachers are working together to really address the needs of all of the students. And in fact, many of the strategies that general ed teachers are learning from special education teachers have enhanced the learning for all of our student groups. And what has, one of the new pieces that we put in place with our last contract cycle is we have a forum for teachers to meet with, teacher leadership, our union leadership, to meet with management about issues that are impacting the teacher workforce. With the adoption of our most recent contract, we actually have a subcommittee of that professional issues group that is looking solely at special education issues. So special education teachers are at the table with management and being part of the strategies that we are putting in place, or even giving feedback about pieces that we've put in place to really enhance that. And we've seen some good progress with that special education PIC, as we call it. Looking forward, we want to better integrate the work of the equity teams that Michelle talked about with our student support teams. So some of those teams have people that overlap, but many of them have a student assistance teams and an equity team in the same school, and they may be employing some of the same strategies. They may not necessarily be communicating as often as they should, and so we want to make sure that those two pieces are integrated. And then again, much like with the gifted and talented and the suspensions, looking at the referrals. So prior to a student being identified, what are the systems that we have in place to support the interventions that are necessary and really identify what's going on before a student gets referred, and ensure that those who are being referred to special education for special education services are really those who are in need of them, as opposed to those who may have fallen through the cracks with our other interventions. And the last piece is really exciting. This is work that we're doing with the county as well, really enhancing our ability to support mental health and trauma training for our staff to support the youth, because there's a small portion of our student population that really have mental health needs that schools currently aren't designed to support. And so working with our county to be able to provide those supports, and really giving our school social workers and counselors who are doing a phenomenal job the tools that they have to identify when a student's needs are beyond what their training can support. And the last student data metric that I wanted to show here are absences. Here we have our American Indian students were over 3 times as likely as our Asian students to be absent. And this measure is looking at 11 or more days, meaning that students have missed more than 11 days of school. And we isolate this metric because if you're at this point, that's a significant amount of instructional loss that students are experiencing. And again, this is almost a 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio here for our highest and lowest student group. Some of the pieces that we've put in place recently, we actually have staff that specifically support American Indian attendance in our attendance office. And we've started a campaign with our county and the city. You may have seen posters around. If not, I will get some to you so that you can share them with your respective communities about attendance matters. And this is a broad campaign to help families understand just the importance of school attendance, but also very targeted to those who are experiencing chronic absences from schools. And as we look forward, we're really trying to be specific about how we support families who have students who are ill because of, students who are absent because of chronic illness. That is very different than a truant student or a student who's just not showing up, and that family requires some specific support. And we've also had conversation with the district and county about how we use our attendance resources, both at the district and the county, and so that we don't have redundancies and we can broaden our reach. And again, like the other pieces, enhancing the school capacity, because parents really have a relationship with their school, with their teacher, and we can do a lot of things as a district to support that work, but what capacity is needed at the school site to really support that, because that's where parents are having their daily interactions. So, just to shift gears a little bit, we don't just measure the student outcome results, we also look at what our leaders are doing in the district. And here we have a metric about how many of our district leaders are implementing racial equity district-wide. And here this says that we have 78%, and we have a vision of 90%. And that's not to say that we're not expecting every leader to do that, but district-wide, we know we have transitions, people come in and out of their roles. So our vision is that 90% of our district leaders are implementing racial equity district-wide. So what does that mean? Here are some of the expectations that we have for people like myself and others who are leading departments and divisions. One is, has that leader engaged in their own racial autobiography? Are they clear about what they're bringing to the table, who they are as they walk into the room in their leadership role? Is there a racial equity work plan in place for the department? Have the staff in that department attended what we consider in our district foundational training? And as Michelle talked about, that's not necessarily conducted all by external facilitators now. We have people well-versed in being able to do beyond diversity in our district. As the leader has its monthly staff meetings, are there explicit expectations for developing their team around racial equity? So for example, when I have my direct report meetings with my staff, we have our business part of our agenda, and then we always have an element where we are continuing to develop ourselves around racial equity. Are we using a racial equity lens or systems thinking as we look at the decisions that we're making as a department? And does each leader in the district have their personal, professional, and organizational goals? And these are not something, obviously your personal goals are your own, but we really have conversations when we are doing performance evaluations about what have you committed to doing as a leader around racial equity professionally and organizationally. We've also asked as an organization for leaders to think about identifying racial equity challenges. So it's not about, so to speak, the easy stuff. It's looking at, if the expectation is that everyone's going to have a racial equity lens, then how do you think about the work that you're doing in your department in terms of racial equity challenges? So Michelle Behrman is much better at giving examples of these than I am, but if, for example, my department, I supervise HR, for example, and we're looking at our hiring process, which you'll see something about that. One of the equity challenges that we may have is, yes, we have a commitment to increasing the diversity of our staff, but our application process isn't necessarily designed to bring people into the beginning of the process. So that would be an equity challenge that we might identify that we would want to put systems in place to address. Do we have the strategies then to address those? Are we taking the action steps? Are they measurable? Is there a timeline associated with that? Because we can't say as leaders we're committed to changing something, to interrupting and eliminating a practice, and then we don't have the pieces that need to be put in place to do that. So, speaking of HR, the first element of our leadership policy is about our recruitment and retention efforts. And we played a lot with the language that we wanted to have in the policy, but you see that our commitment is to developing a workforce of racially conscious and culturally competent staff. And that means that you don't necessarily have to walk in the door being Michelle Behrman, although that would be lovely, but that you have a commitment to your own racial consciousness and cultural competency in terms of being able to navigate who you are and how you're showing up in your decision making. So we looked at our retention rates, and we looked back to 2011, which was the beginning of our strategic plan, and we assessed of the new hires that we had, and this is across the district, there were 153 new hires, and we looked 3 years later, where are our staff? Have we retained that staff? And we've actually retained 52% of the individuals that were hired in 2011. Our vision would be that we have an 80% retention rate. We then went and broke out how that retention played out. Of the 153 staff hired, we had 127 of the staff were white, that's 83% of the hiring, and we had 17% or 26 were people of color. And as you see, we were able to retain 50% of our white employees that were hired in 2011, and we were able to retain 65% of the people of color that were hired in 2011. So that's as far as we've been able to go with the metrics associated with this. Where we're looking to do now is to go back to the point that I made, looking at the percent of our applicants that were actually people of color or indigenous people, and looking at the percent of those who made it through the interview process that were people of color or indigenous. And it's important to track those two pieces because you're not going to get to an outcome of increasing your diversity of your hiring pool if you don't have intentional efforts at the application level as well as folks who make it through the application process. process to an interview. We haven't quite figured out the metric for this yet because our process is that it's voluntary and self-reporting for our application and interview process. So clearly when people fill out their HR forms and they're hired and they identify racially, we know that, but we haven't yet put in a system that will allow us to track that consistently from the beginning of the application process. This is also an interesting metric around teacher retention. And this is an area that we're going to be looking at as well. But in our district, 30% of our teachers have less than 4 years teaching experience in St. Paul Public Schools. Doesn't mean that they couldn't have come from another district with teaching experience, but 30% of our teaching population have been there less than 4 years. And we took a metric of how many of our schools have teaching staff that have been there. We looked at how many schools were 10 percentage points above the district average. So we looked at 40%. And we have 22 out of our 64 schools with more than 40% of their teachers with less than 4 years experience in our district. And the reason why we looked at this is we do think that it's important the stability of the teaching population in the school is important, but we also looked at the 22 schools, and the majority of those schools are schools that are on our priority or focus list, for example, which means they have a designation from the state that they're among our quote-unquote lower performing across the state. And they also are the schools with the highest percentages of students of color and low-income students. And so we think that it's important to have stability in terms of our teaching population, but also that if we're trying to move the achievement gap, having teachers that are more well-versed and experienced in the St. Paul expectations and ways would also help our teaching population. So we're looking at other ways to measure teacher retention, but right now we're looking at it in terms of the years of experience in our district. So what are some of the things that we're doing to increase and address that? We have actually worked with both our traditional colleges and universities to actually develop partnerships with our student professional organizations. So not just the university, but what partnerships can we develop with our students, particularly students of color, professional organizations to make St. Paul an attractive place, St. Paul Public Schools an attractive place for them to seek work. And we've established partnerships with at least one HBCU and HSI right now to build a pipeline of student recruits. As we look forward, of course, we think one of the best opportunities we have is to grow our own, and we actually have language in our most recent contract with our educational assistants to provide stipend for them to pursue a teaching career, and we will continue to promote that among all of our paraprofessionals. So I'm going to turn it over here to the last portion of our presentation to Michelle to talk a little bit about our teaching and learning efforts. And this is an area where we're still finessing how we measure that, but we have some expectations that Michelle will share.
So if we go back to thinking that phase 3 of the work, which is really what we're entering into, we've had some pilot programs with teachers to begin to identify new practices, and we have a number of teachers who were involved from 7 of our beacon schools who were involved in culturally responsive teaching pieces called CARE. And that group actually went in and began to identify focal students, watch each other teach, and try new practices. So as a system, we're just entering into a system-wide discussion around how will the Office of Academics, through the Office of Teaching and Learning, specialized services, and multi-language learners, as well as personalized learning, come together to really bring that teaching and learning to staff so that staff can begin to look at their practices. And the 3 main pieces of the policy, as you can see, is a rigorous and positive school environment, collaborating as teachers and administrators to create and implement culturally responsive practices, and eliminating practices that lead to the over or underrepresentation. And it's key to really think about all 3 of those pieces. My background originally was curriculum and instruction, so when I think about being a classroom teacher, some of it, of course, is what I do as a classroom teacher, and then some of it is with the departments and how they bring the curriculum, the content, and the instructional training to the staff to implement. So moving through this, we take a look at, we have a support system for our schools. It's called the MTSS, the Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Vertical Teams. And those are aligned with elementary schools, as well as middle schools and high school. And that team of folks come from all those academic departments I mentioned, and that group is building their ability to coach through an equity lens. So when they're sitting with the teacher groups collaborating in the schools, they're able to talk about data cycles by demographics, what are the results for different student groups looking like. That group has established a equity team type piece where they work together. They also attend coaching academy training, and they're a 90% racial equity PD piece. It's a little bit deceiving because this is a moving mark. It's going to change because there's different levels of training. So as we go deeper into measurement, we're going to want to keep deepening folks' work. In other words, you're never done with developing in this work. I want to also say that the majority of our teachers, licensed teachers in St. Paul Public Schools, look like me. They're white teachers, and as a white teacher and as a white administrator, a lot of this work starts with that foundational piece. If I can't see the water I swim in, because I'm a member of the dominant culture, I first have to put that mirror up and then move to my instruction. So in other words, I can't just get a set of strategies that supposedly work with this student or that student. I really need to see myself as a person culturally and racially, and then begin to look at the practices, and a more common layman's term is bias. We all have bias, and how do I bring that into the classroom or not? And I bring that up because sometimes it's really hard to think about teaching and learning to go beyond the individual teachers. So it's both beyond, it's both beyond individual teachers, and it is individual teachers, and that's tough because you know, it's hard to do that personal, local, immediate journey, and that's what we're engaged in right now. And we're moving with our teaching staff now into really looking at what is an equitable learning environment at St. Paul Public Schools. So that takes us away from that individual teacher in their classroom to what is happening in the environment. We're looking at student leadership, equity teams in place, professional learning communities, culturally responsive framework, job-embedded equity and professional development. We have school sites that meet every week with groups of people to engage in the work. Communities and families engaged. Racially conscious positive behavioral interventions and supports. When we say instruction is rigorous, relevant, real, and relationship-based, that's really the foundation we use when we think about culturally responsive teaching. So are students being held to high standards? Are they receiving the support to meet those high standards? And that's all students. Are students able to show up as themselves? And that means, am I able to communicate and write and express myself as a student in a way that fits with some of the way that I would normally be able to relate to an experience? So can I share my family? Can I share who I am as a person? Real is, the real I just explained. Relevant is it relevant to my learning? So how many of you have done projects before that you really got excited in because you had a personal connection? So I think about Gordon Parks. The students got involved in the light rail process. They studied that for 4 years. They followed it. They aligned their learning to it. That was relevant to what was happening right outside the door of the school. And then relationships. Not that I think I have a relationship with students, but that we have a reciprocal relationship. And that relationship is one of the highest factors in learning for students. So these are the measures we're looking at to really begin to look at, do we have equitable learning environments? And that's what we'll be using for our baseline moving forward. So there's been some different efforts we've looked at because you have to work interdepartmentally. How is personalized learning and special ed and the Office of Teaching and Learning and the Equity Department all coming together so that teachers aren't getting a lot of things all over the place? You know, as a classroom teacher, if it didn't click like this for me, it was really hard for me to get my head around it day to day. We're looking at the Learn framework. That's a coaching tool to help us see that yes, it's lessons, yes, it's looking at your students' data, but it's also so much more, and I'll highlight that at the end. Racial equity through personalized learning. You might have heard about the technology tools that we're putting in students' and teachers' hands through iPads in order to be able to personalize learning. We're seeing some amazing things. Students who might be ahead in the class, or in a case of some of our students have said, I don't understand that math equation. You know, I need to learn it a different way. They're able to get on their iPad, maybe see it done a few different ways. It's really moving some of the interesting work forward in terms of student voice. Looking forward, we need to strengthen our culturally responsive teaching and learning practices district-wide. That will come from a professional development plan from Christine Osorio, Chief Osorio's office, that she's putting together as she brings people together this year. Promoting rigorous and engaging learning environments through personalized learning, and expanding our teacher leadership. And this is really the exciting part, expanding the teacher leadership. I have over 60 principals, teachers, and EAs, TAs that are coming on their own time to pilot a project called the Innocent Classroom Project, which really looks at how do you set up your classroom in a way that students can come and get away from the normed script they're fed, and how teachers can begin to see their students differently. And I've got, like I said, I wanted to just have teachers, and then the teachers said, our principals want to come with us, and then the EAs and TAs that work with the teachers said, we want to come because we want to be able to support the teachers. And I had a waiting list, so it's really exciting to see that we have lots of places that teachers are wanting to engage in the work. We also have 4 schools working with National Urban Alliance on some strategies. Those schools are looking currently at the standards and the content and saying, how can we make the content that the state puts out more relevant to the students we have in front of us in St. Paul Public Schools? And how do we hear the students and what is relevant? Because oftentimes what I think is relevant for a student is not. I always say, hey, if a student's idea of a good time is what, you know, this 40-year-old white woman likes to do, there's probably a real disconnect going on. So last piece is learn. That's the culturally responsive teaching and learning framework. And it combines the lessons that we talked about with the awareness, with my role as an educator, and then moving into cultural competence and personal development, the windows and mirrors. Recognizing that through my students' experiences, I can learn more about my students, but I'm never going to have the same experience as the students in front of me. And I use I because this work is about personal, local, and immediate. And so how do each of us personalize the work for ourselves? And I just happen to have been a classroom teacher, so I'm able to kind of do that piece a little bit. So it's all about getting authentic, being able to show up as we are, have rigorous, engaging classrooms, because our students are brilliant. They just need strong instruction to get them there. And instruction that really reflects that personalization that students are really kind of running towards nowadays. Have you noticed even with your grandkids or your children or your nieces and nephews, hands-on, those types of pieces really seem to connect. So I'll turn it back over to Chief Walker.
Michelle, you would. Catherine Page is going to go around those of you who have questions, and she'll bring the microphone to you. But you can see why I wish this room were filled with people to understand what's going on here. You guys, it reminds me of 1973 when my wife and I moved to Boston. And in Boston, my wife started teaching at Roxbury Community College. Roxbury Community College was just being developed at that time. If you know Roxbury, it is the part of Boston that's the African American community. And what Roxbury Community College was an old car garage that was being refashioned into a school. At the same time, over in Charlestown, mostly white suburb, a brand new, beautiful community college was being built called Bunker Hills Community College. And what I was thinking about today is, I just hope that you're able to communicate to people that what's going on here is that our school system is trying to repurpose a structure from the 1950s and 60s for an industrial, manufacturing, and agricultural society dominated by white culture to now function for a multicultural, multilingual information age culture. So having to redesign, when my wife was teaching, the carpenters and the plumbers and the electricians were all around where she was teaching in the room. And sometimes, the power saws were going when she was trying to teach. I think we need to communicate to people the hard work that our systems are trying to do to catch up. I mean, it's like in 2000, we finally recognized that we no longer were in an industrial all-white era, but we were in a multicultural information era. And we're trying to repurpose the system. And I'm just very, very pleased for what you are doing and for what you shared with us today. I wish you the best. If you want to make any comment to see if that image fits at all with how it feels for you guys, I give it to you, and then there are going to be some questions.
Well, I just want to say I appreciate the image. It certainly feels like we are flying the plane and fixing the parts or whatever that other, yes, the other metaphor is. But I think one of the beauties of the St. Paul Public Schools, at least that was attractive to me when I came here, is the diversity of our student population and the commitment to that diversity. But I also am mindful of our intentional efforts as a system to move beyond diversity and cultural competency to the intentionality around racial equity. And I think I get to go to work every day with people who are committed to this work. If you look at our superintendent's cabinet and our leadership team, the diversity of racial, ethnic, age, thought, even regional, where people are coming from, is exciting. I see that in some of our schools, not in enough of our schools, but I think what we're trying to do is really create that system that supports that supports all of our wonderful students and staff, however they show up, and give people the support to get there. Be clear on the expectations, be clear on the support that's provided for that work. And so it's tough work, but it is the right work to be doing, and we have a board here with us, and Carol and John Broderick and all of our board members that are committed to this and that are actually holding us accountable to this work as well. So.
Okay.
All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for holding this. My name is Keith Brooks. My first question is, how are the internal facilitators chosen?
Well, Michelle will probably answer this better, but right now, the internal facilitators are members of our racial equity office and other departments who have actually gone through a training. They go through an affiliate training because in order Beyond Diversity is actually a professional development opportunity provided by Pacific Educational Group. So in order for us to be able to facilitate that, we need to be trained by them. And so we have folks who've gone through that training, and Michelle is about to actually do another cohort of individuals who will get the affiliate training.
Okay. And like you said, this is developmental, so for the principals who may not be as far along in regards to cultural competence, how are the area superintendents supporting them or challenging them or pushing them in a loving way around these issues?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So we have a few ways that happens. If you remember when we went through the training process, when we did our initial what we call leads training, actually when we did Beyond Diversity as well as the follow-up training, our principals were actually training with us. So central administration and principals trained together. And we all went through, I think it was over 2 years, a period of time where we got supports. And now our principals meetings, which are hosted by our assistant superintendents and our director of leadership development, are all organized around racial equity development. So there's, of course, the staff part of their meetings, but they actually do racial equity development at all of their principals meetings. And then in the principal evaluation process, there are also expectations around their racial equity work in the principal evaluation tool, which the assistant superintendents do.
Okay. And very quickly, and I'll pass the microphone. I'm not trying to monopolize the conversation. How do you address the racist assumption that every white applicant is more qualified than a person of color?
You address that by designing an application process that doesn't have that assumption, and that's what we've been doing in HR. And if there's a commitment to increasing the diversity of our staff, then we need to be intentional both in where we post the positions, how we seek applicants, the kinds of questions that we ask. And again, I go back to the language in our policy. The language in our policy is about having racially conscious and culturally competent individuals, regardless of their race. And so we want folks who are racially conscious, whether they are white, black, American, Indian, Asian, Latino. And so we are intentional about designing our processes so that they seek that out, both in what is the position description, what are the qualifications for the position that's necessary, who's on the interview panel for the process, where are we posting the positions, who have we sought in terms of getting recommendations for who to apply. And so we've done that in HR, we've changed those processes quite a bit for many of our positions.
Lastly, there are a few people of color.
Can I add just one thing on that?
Yes, ma'am.
So there's definitely systems places, and Chief Walker spoke to those. There's also the work of folks like myself, white folks, in interrupting that when those conversations ever happen. So really helping folks to understand that that is not an accurate statement, and then what that statement does for a system when folks state that. So it takes white allies with other whites to really have some of those conversations.
Thank you. I know a number of people of color who are currently professionals and who have gone through and done all the coursework to get their teaching license, but can't quit their jobs to do the traditional student teaching. Well, what are some of the conversations happening around making some of those adjustments?
That is an excellent question, and we've had a number of conversations. Probably someone is representing us right now at the Capitol about the qualifications for teacher licensing and how we do student teaching. We know that for our EA population in particular, we've been working on arrangements about how they can get their student teaching hours without having to actually stop being an EA and not having any financial revenue to be able to do that. So we've been working with all the folks who have the power to change those decisions and have also been trying to be creative internally on how we do that work. But it's a viable question, and we welcome all the support to our legislators and our Board of Teaching and others to help change that process.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the presentation. You did a wonderful job. My name is Doris, and I've been around a long time. I'm sitting here listening to this and remembering my copy that I still have of a report called Minding the Gap, which is almost 20 years old now, where things have gotten progressively worse across the entire state of Minnesota, but in particular between St. Paul and Minneapolis. I'm wondering why, with all those business people and all those wealthy people and all those bright minds in Minnesota and all those politicians in Minnesota, why we are further behind than when I was in the classroom way longer before then. And my daughters are grown with children since then. And we are talking about the things that have been a problem here. And I'm just curious about where are people going to start telling the truth about we talk about bias, assumptions, stereotypes, that's great, but we never really address it because Minnesotans are nice and they've always been nice. But it's costing whole communities, these are children, whether they're black children, traditional American Indian children, and that continues. The new groups of people who don't fit well or people don't like or don't want around, and it's killing our state. And back when Minding the Gap done, the state demographer told us then how many jobs we were going to need, how many educated people we were going to need. That's almost 20 years ago, and we're still talking this stuff and we're further behind. So how much of all of this stuff is going to make change, I don't know. But I hope in 20 years I'm not sent to another one of these meetings listening to the same thing as people file lawsuits and our children fail. Because when children don't look like me, it's been amazing in Minnesota. And I used to teach in the classroom before civil rights, and I can tell you, everybody got taught, didn't matter what color the teacher was, so I don't know where it all went to heck in the handbasket, or whether there were a majority of white students, people will learn.
Well, I'm not sure that I have an answer to that other than to underscore the commitment, again, to racial equity work. I'm not from Minnesota, so I guess I have a little bit more latitude to speak about Minnesota nice because I'm still trying to understand it. I'm from New York, so I'm the opposite of Minnesota nice. But what I will say is it really is about the mirror, and I think that's what makes this conversation probably very difficult and uncomfortable for many well-meaning individuals, because this is not about your intentions. We have language in this work about intent versus impact, and it really does force all of us to examine our not just biases, but what we're bringing to the table, not just white individuals, but people of color as well, some of whom have upheld systems that don't support systemically and collectively our students of color. So what I'm encouraged about is that we now have a consistent framework and language to have this conversation. I share some of your concerns about the urgency writ large about making the change. I certainly don't hope to be here 20 years from now being in this situation, but let's not fool ourselves that this is systemic change. And we have had a lot of well-meaning people talking about it for quite some time, but we haven't necessarily had the tools in place to follow up on that. The other piece that I would point out about this work is, as a school district, we've taken this on, but I don't think that we are alone with this work, because we have the partnership of the city and the county in a meaningful way around this work. And it has changed conversations that we have with our county colleagues, with our city colleagues about this work and what they're willing to partner and change too. So I think that is something different. I don't have the context of this community 20 years ago. I have the context of the last decade or so. And I feel encouraged that we have the pieces in place to make it work. But you are absolutely right that it's going to take more than the school district and more than the people in this room to make those changes.
One resource we might want to look at is a professor at Stanford Graduate School of Education, Sean Reardon. Maybe some of you know his work. He's looked over the last 20 or 30 years, and he shows how poverty and inequality have incredibly exacerbated this problem and made it much, much harder for school systems to be able to solve problems. But it's really interesting, the work that he's done. And again, I said at the beginning of this thing, since we started public education in the beginning of the 20th century, we expected our public schools to solve our social problems. And sometimes the community just doesn't take responsibility for the problems in the community itself, so that teachers can be about the work of education. Another question?
Yes, I'm Ruth Ann Olson, and I want to thank you very much for this presentation. Certainly want to thank the Achievement Gap Committee for bringing you back to give us another update. I have to agree totally with the earlier comments. One of the problems with a democracy is that it often has a very short attention span. And whether it's winding the gap or they're just report after report, program after program, focus after focus, we just see them come and go. One of the sad points in my own life was about 25 years ago, which I wrote a little piece called White Privilege in Schools. And as recently as 3 months ago, I got a call about reproducing that somewhere. I mean, that's ridiculous. I was 25 years ago, the whole piece was written about my children. Now that's the grandchildren, I've got great-grandchildren coming, so there you go. So my question is, how long do you think you have to prove that what you're doing is effective? So breathing down your neck, breathing down your back kind of question. And then second and related, you are, I think, a bit of an island in doing this work. And what do you need from the larger community to support what you're doing?
So I guess I would flip the first question about how long do we have to prove that what we're doing is the right thing. I would flip that question and say we have proof that what we've been doing before isn't the right thing. And so I think that we have to be intentional and we have to be purposeful about the work that we're doing. So I would actually challenge anyone who's asking us to prove if there is institutional racism in this country, in this city, in this school district, to prove to me where it isn't, because I think history has told us that it does exist. And so therefore, that to me gives us the fuel, quite frankly, to do this work. Now, to your point about people's attention spans being short, I do think that people want to see quick results, and I'm not sure that that is the right response for this work. This is not going to happen quickly. At the same time, we should have some expectations of practices changing and outcomes changing at least incrementally until they can be more accelerated. So my first piece is I should hope that I don't have to prove that we need to do racial equity work, because history has proven that what we have been doing is right. To the second point about the support that we need, Michelle talked about it in terms of her own work and the work in our system of the role of white allies in this work. I'm very clear that there is, particularly because of my position, I can speak a lot about this work, and because I am a Black woman, I can speak about this work, but I am very clear about the power of our white allies speaking about the importance of this work within our system and outside of our system. I'm very clear about the power of St. Paul residents talking about the importance of what they want to see from our school system and the outcomes that they want to see. I'm very clear on the power of Minnesotans saying that this is the commitment of what they want. So to me, it's less about this superintendent and this strategic plan and this board, and more about what are the outcomes that we want to see for all of our St. Paul children, all of our Minnesotan children. And if equity is the work that we think is important, we need a lot more people than just us saying that it's important. And so that's really honestly what we need. You can argue about if it's PEG's model or somebody else's model. But if our commitment is to equitable outcomes and the elimination of disparities, then we need as many allies, and in particular white allies, saying that this work is important. So that would be my answer.
Any other questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Tyree Ross. I just had a couple of little lighter questions for you. You mentioned in the beginning about family community engagement around racial equity. For families that are under-resourced, may not have internet access and cell phones and those types of things, how do they get involved with the parent advisory committees that are being formed and encouraged to grow?
Sure. So the committees that we referenced in the vision card are our district-wide committees. So we have 10 of those that are sort of representative across the district. Again, I go back to the school site as probably the first place to identify those parents who want to be more involved and roll up their sleeves. They initially have a connection with their schools. And we follow up with schools to say, are there parents who want to be involved in a larger conversation about this work, and get recommendations from them for people who might want to be a part of the parent advisory committees. Our family engagement office also is pretty engaged, particularly around enrollment time and other festivity times out there in the community, and they tap parents who they know show up to a lot of things, who are interested. And then we're also intentional. We know that it's not convenient for many parents to always show up to school or to come to the district for events, so we want to make sure that we're sending communication not just through us, but actually through the parent committees, through their respective networks, to other parents who might not be able to show up. So we have actually a whole office dedicated to parent and family engagement, and they are responsible for kind of helping spread the word and inform parents. And one of the pieces of this work is really trying to use Parent Academy as a vehicle to explain what we're doing, because this is kind of complex to people who are just, can you educate my kid? Can you make sure that they're well taken care of? We use that as a vehicle to help parents understand this and unpack this work, and also to identify parents who could be resources to others to do it. So that's kind of some of the ways that we go about it.
And I just have one more question around the phases of the courageous conversations and how it's been kind of accumulating over the last 4 years or so. What's in place to support new principals, new teachers as they've been hired throughout those phases? And then if you have new teachers and principals coming in 15, 16 year, how are they supported and maybe getting caught up in that training?
So with our teachers, we're still at a point, and we'll probably always be a point at St. Paul Public Schools where we're regularly offer Beyond Diversity. So as folks are coming on board into St. Paul Public Schools, they are attending Beyond Diversity. Then, depending on what your position in the district, the support you get, or the support you receive or take part in, is worked in a variety of ways. We're very fortunate to have a director of leadership and development who also is grounded in this work, so he's able to work with new principals through his office and having those principals have mentors, have really kind of assess where are the principals in the work, what support do the principals need. We also have our leads boosters pieces, and then we do both group and individual coaching. And as we move past this year, our office will be offering more racial equity training to do exactly what you just said, to break down the different components of the training and offer times and places for groups of folks who are new to maybe come and get some information and practice around the protocols, or practice on critical race theory or adaptive thinking. And we'll be doing some of that direct, more in-depth training. We also are fortunate that this work is in much deeper in a variety of departments, including our operations. So the equity teams, and the idea is how do you build the capacity of the leadership within the departments? So our operations, for example, they have an equity team and we check in with them, but they're really determining, okay, we have 70 staff members that have not been through Beyond Diversity. We want to be able to offer it for this purpose. So you're seeing that more adaptive, in-depth development around the work from a variety of different departments. Specialized learning has an ongoing larger piece. And if we think back to the slide of those different components that were put up, that's kind of what we do. We sit with the department and we say, what are your equity challenges who are new in your department? We kind of diagnose and put together a plan with them and then go ahead and implement that plan. Has to be very differentiated, just to be really clear, because as you indicated, everybody's at a different place and we have new folks. Just want to mention one item that we're noticing is a pattern now over the last 2 years. We're increasingly having people apply for positions in openings in St. Paul Public Schools who have been part of Pacific Educational's Courageous Conversation work in other districts, and who have also been involved in other types of equity work. So we're seeing an increase of folks coming in with that equity lens and then just going deeper from there.
Is there any talk or any thought of doing the workshops for other decision makers or entry point people in the city? City councils, city employees, county commissioners. You know, I've been a teacher for a long time. I did administrative work. I've worked in education reform, and it just seems like if we're going to get this work done, you have to work as a community, and whether it's people whose kids are gone from school, who don't know that this work is going on, police departments, social workers, you know, nurses, you know, the whole it takes a village thing. It seems like forever we've worked in isolation, so.
That's actually one of the pieces that we're very excited about in the district. We have gone through training with the city and counties. So our senior leadership team went through training with the county and the city's senior leadership team. The city has now adopted their own racial equity training, and they are going through a similar process that we did, starting with their leadership and then going out. The county uses a different frame, but at least some divisions of the county have been engaged in this for a really long time, and now collectively the county is doing that. When we do Beyond Diversity, we've actually had slots in our Beyond Diversity for our community partners, so partners who are working with us around this work. We've had city folks attend outside of the training that they've had. I think we've had county folks as well. Interestingly, was at the last Beyond Diversity, we had some of the architects who are actually going to be working with our schools participate in Beyond Diversity, as well as members of the Minnesota Department of Education. So they came to Beyond Diversity that was facilitated internally by SPPS, and we had, I don't remember how many, but it was a significant number of of MDE staff, as well as some of the folks who are technically vendors to our district, but want to be aware of our work. So that's actually a very exciting part of our work, and Michelle can talk more about it if I forgot anything there. But we have created a venue to increase the awareness of our community and the folks that support our school system around this work as well. And that was out of the intentional efforts of our department. So our facilities department said, we want the architects who are working with us to go through this experience, and we created that opportunity. And our funded programs Title I office said, MDE is working with us on school improvement and they want to have a better idea about what we're doing. So yes, those opportunities exist, and we always encourage people to do more of that. We actually also partnered with East Metro Integration District for other districts to be a part of this work as well. And so we have a good structure in place for people to at least get the foundational training. The more extensive pieces, we need to work on that, but the foundational training, yes.
One
Did I
last
forget
question.
anything?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrea Science. I'm a culturally responsive teaching coach and sheltered instruction coach in West St. Paul. And my question was about your equity teams. And can you talk a little bit about what they do, how they do it, criteria for people to be a member of the equity teams at each site, and how they are supported at each site to do their work?
Sure.
Thanks.
So we offer 2 cohorts of equity teams. So every school site in St. Paul Public Schools put together an equity team, and with their principal, they attended a 6-seminar series as well as Beyond Diversity. And from there, the school develops its equity team. That group spent the first half of their training really working together, and then they take a look at their school and they begin to say, what are our equity challenges in the school, and what do we need to build our capacity to address those challenges. And the first couple of years, we actually, in our office, we don't have the capacity to assign schools to us, as a kind of a caseworker type of piece. So we would check in with schools, much as we do with departments, begin to help them identify their equity challenges. The assistant superintendents, which oversee the schools, support the principals as they support the E-teams as well. The type of work and the depth of the E-teams really vary. There's a few schools who have taken their leadership team and their equity team together, and that's working very effectively. There are others who have 2 separate teams. One of our elementary schools has an equity team that meets every week. They meet in the morning, they address what is happening in the building, they develop long-term professional development plans for the staff. Others meet more once a month, but they meet in smaller PLC groups between that time, where they're working with 5 or 6 teachers. So it really does vary, but each school is expected to have an equity team to do that work. How the equity teams were chosen was a process that was recommended from Pacific Educational Group with some modifications. It's important to choose a racially diverse team, but not an entirely equity team of color. And I remember the first equity team cohort that met, the facilitator for Pacific Education Group walked in and said, oh my gosh, your district is very racially diverse. You have a lot of teachers of color. And I said, actually, I think this is all of our teachers of color. So we had to work with the principals to really think about this work can't lay on the shoulders of the staff of color, particularly if there's 1 or 2 staff members of color. So how do you choose the person who maybe is open once they believe something, but is somebody who has a lot of respect in the building? How do you do a couple of early adopters? You don't want all Michelle Biermans on your team because people are like, oh, here she comes again. And, so you want a variety of folks, and you want to tap into people who are mainly open. And that's one of the things that I think is a misnomer about this work. I really thought coming into this work that I wouldn't see folks who really were closed-minded in terms of understanding that race does impact life, that would be able to make that transition, because it's hard as a white person to really every day engage, because you can, I'm not saying woe is me, I'm just saying I get to choose to go home and not engage. I'm amazed at the folks. We had somebody in Beyond Diversity say, I did some things that were unintentionally racially insensitive, and that's why I'm in here, and I'm willing to be taped to be a lesson and a message to other staff members, because I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't realize my intent versus my impact. So those are some of the things that equity teams do. They create environments for people to really start talking about your biases, where you're at, and then bringing that out to the staff. But it can't, if the equity team is not made up interracially, creates a safe space to be able to do that. And we do see folks coming from all different levels, so.
So our contact information is on the slide here, and Grant will have the presentation. I do want to point out that if you go to our equity webpage, you'll find lots of resources, but also if you go to the accountability site, that's where this vision card and all the rest of them are. And I would be remiss if I let you leave here today without letting you know that St. Paul Public Schools, our graduation data was released today. The state released graduation data for all of the districts, and our district continues to increase, and we continue to see gaps closing. It is the one data point that I'm super excited to have to share, because I very often have to share the bad news as well. So I want you to know that we're doing well with graduation, and all of that is posted on our website. You can get specific details about that. But there are lots of good things working in St. Paul schools, and graduation rates are one of them. So thank you.
Number one, again, you can see why I wish we had 150 people in this room. But you can direct people to this. If you know people who are running for the St. Paul School Board, they need